Oh, welcome. Hello, I'm Paul Collier. And I was sitting here a bit despondent because I'm, as you see, all alone in this magnificent auditorium. And exactly a year ago, we were in the midst of an absolutely brilliant course. This room was packed with people from all over the world, all with experience of trying to make the best out of natural resources. We had government ministers, we had civil servants, we had journalists, we had people working in the private sector in the resource extraction companies. And one of the fascinating things was that at the beginning of the week, each of these groups thought that the other groups had horns coming out of their heads. They saw themselves as enemy groups. The politicians were scared of the journalists didn't trust the politicians, neither of them trusted the companies, and of course, all of them thought the civil servants weren't doing their job properly. By the end of the week, they'd made friends for life. And they discovered that mostly they faced a common struggle, that managing natural resources is really difficult, and they learned from each other over that course of that week. And now this room is empty because, of course, because of COVID, we can't do the course. And so what we're doing instead is this Zoom mini picture of that wonderful week. During that week, we had some of the finest experts from around the world. And so we've got a sample of what a few of them said. So that's, this is a Zoominar, and so like all Zoominars, things can go wrong. I'm live. It's a really complex Zoominar. We've got clips, we've got slides, and periodically we've got me. I stay with the course for the entire week trying to guide people through. And so I'll be guiding us through this Zoom. If we pull it off, it's a triumph for the technical team here. If there are glitches, be forgiving. It's not the first glitch that's happened in a Zoom, right? So all this work, all this course has been a partnership with the Natural Resource Governance Institute, the practitioner team. It's an academic practitioner partnership. And so before we get going, whilst I go to the front and prepare my guidance through the course, we're going to hear a word from Sunita from the Natural Resource Governance Institute. Over to you, Sunita.
Thanks so much, Paul. It's really a pleasure to be here today, even if virtually, and of course to continue our longstanding partnership with BSG. For the past 15 years, the Natural Resource Governance Institute has worked hand in hand with policymakers who manage oil, gas, and mineral resources on behalf of their citizens. As Paul said, even in the best of times, it's incredibly difficult for reform-minded officials to ensure that natural resources are a catalyst for a better quality of life, to reduce poverty, to increase access to and delivery of social services, and to strengthen trust between governments and citizens. But the coronavirus pandemic and its economic and social impacts have brought unprecedented challenges to this already daunting task. Many resource-rich countries now are struggling with sizable and growing debt, with rising poverty and social unrest, with limited avenues for revenue generation and weak social and fiscal safety nets. The magnitude of the current crisis can truly feel overwhelming for all of us. Yet we also believe that with the crisis comes an opportunity to learn from the past and to build a more stable and sustainable future. To do so, NRGI is working with our partners around the world to support countries to address the most pressing challenges that they face today. First, we're helping countries to guard against a race to the bottom. With a decline in commodity prices, companies are seeking to stem losses and governments are in desperate need of revenues. With that, the desire to court and maintain investors can incentivize bad deals or contract amendments, creating a race to the bottom that actually lowers environmental, social, and governance standards that have long been fought for. Countries may also inappropriately relax fiscal rules without proper oversight and careful consideration of the extent, the time frame, the sources of funding, the priority expenditures. How revenues are managed is, of course, always important, but even more so when those revenues are so limited. We at NRGI are working with policymakers to ensure that they understand the trade-offs they face and avoid short-term decisions that could undermine long-term economic health and stability. Secondly, we are working with countries to avoid and reduce dependency. Revenue dependency has been a long-standing challenge for resource-rich countries. The oil price crash and its economic reverberations, though, have led to plummeting revenues for some resource-rich countries, serving as a stark reminder of the finiteness of the market and the volatility. As countries are managing this immediate economic crisis, NRGI is also working to help dismantle the mechanisms that can actually enable dependency to take root. For example, resource-backed lending, particularly taken on by new or prospective producers, can entrench dependency and reduce future choices. The national oil companies may withhold or consume revenues when countries need them most. We know that the average national oil company remits only $1 in every $4 that it receives to its government. Instead of spending money on rebuilding economies, money may be reinvested in a risky and declining sector. NRGI is supporting countries to assess and address their exposure to dependency. Third, and of course relatedly, we are working to ensure that countries are prepared to navigate the global energy transition. The coronavirus pandemic has unfolded against a backdrop of the climate crisis. Together, we must think beyond immediate term recovery to what we are building back to. A world with clean, diverse, secure domestic energy systems that meet countries' own needs. A world where countries can seize new economic opportunities associated with the demand for minerals needed to expand green technologies. A world where countries are not held captive by industries that are unstable and time-bound. For new producers, NRGI is helping to assess decisions that support their long-term economic, social, and environmental sustainability. For more established producers, NRGI is working with governments and SOEs to avoid hitting repeat on past policies and practices, and instead to pivot to embrace new and more forward-looking strategies that incorporate these energy transition realities. And in countries where strategic minerals are being extracted, NRGI ensures there's an opportunity for a new deal for mining countries and mining affected communities. We know that the decisions that countries take now are absolutely critical for their prospects for economic recovery, stability, and resilience to withstand future crises. NRGI's experts and BSG faculty can provide the analysis and the expertise to help countries take decisions that are in the best interest of their current and future generations. Through open and informed dialogue between citizens, industry, and policymakers, NRGI works to bridge knowledge in the classroom to action and impact in the real world. And together, we believe we can rebuild and transform resource-rich economies. Thanks so much, Paul. I'll leave it there, but I look forward to further insights from you and our other colleagues, and of course, most importantly, to seeing you in 2021. Thank you.
Thanks, Anita. And I want you to imagine that you're sitting just where I was sitting. Right? You're a member of this course, and your country's got some natural resources, that news is a bit like the news of coronavirus, because around the world, governments were plunged into uncertainty. Any government official that asked, what should we do? The right answer at the time, back in January, the right answer was, we don't know. And a natural resource discovery is a bit like that. But if the situation is, we don't know what to do, then the right answer is find out as fast as possible. Find out from each other. That was the sensible thing to do in COVID, was learn from the first countries to get the disease. And it's the right answer with natural resources. Learn from other countries. And that's why we typically have many countries represented in this course. So a natural resource discovery is a bit like a rocket, but it's a rocket without a guidance system. And so it's a very dangerous rocket. It can take you fast somewhere, but it depends on the guidance that you give that rocket where it takes you. It can take you up to prosperity, but it can also take you down. And let me start with an example of that. It's an example of two little countries which about 60 years ago discovered the same valuable natural resource, diamonds. They were both very poor. One had an advantage on the other. It was a good coastal position with a lot of rain. The other place was landlocked and semi-arid. But what happened? Well, the one that was landlocked and semi-arid used those diamonds very, very cleverly to hold the country together, to invest in the future. And it's now pretty well the most prosperous country per capita in the whole of its continent. It used diamonds as the rocket to prosperity. For many years, it was the fastest growing country in the world. That's Botswana. And now we're going to go to the other diamond discovery 60 years ago, and that's Sierra Leone. Much better located, good coast, fertile land, a lot of rainfall. And what did that rocket of diamonds do to Sierra Leone? It took it to the global bottom of the Human Development Index. The poorest, saddest country in the world by about 20 years ago. And that was because the diamonds had triggered first a lot of corruption and then open, violent conflict with a large gang controlling most of the country and exploiting people as well as the diamonds. So that's the rocket. It's a very dangerous rocket. It's dangerous, it's so dangerous that natural resources are now being called the resource curse, not the resource opportunity, the resource curse. And to understand why that phrase has developed, we're going to turn to the first of our experts. It's Jim Cust, who's senior economist in the Africa region of the World Bank. And he is a specialist on natural resource management and mismanagement. So over to you, Jim. Tell us about the resource curse.
But what is the resource curse? The resource curse has been carefully studied for almost 4 decades now, and it describes the negative effects, either economic or political, that are caused by a country becoming resource rich or resource dependent. The simplest version of the curse is the idea that resource-rich countries who export a lot of natural resources have grown more slowly than their resource-poor neighbors. Other versions of this phenomena that have been documented in research include describing countries that have faced more corruption, more conflict, or a deterioration in democratic institutions due to their resource abundance and dependence. Other examples include countries who have experienced deindustrialization, environmental damage, or excessive volatility due to an over-reliance on primary commodity exports. More recent research into the resource curse suggests that the curse is not deterministic. So some countries have performed very well in recent decades, despite resources making up a significant fraction of export earnings and government revenues. So examples include Chile and its copper deposits, Botswana and its diamonds, or Malaysia or Norway and their oil and gas. So the modern understanding of the resource curse is that it doesn't affect everybody. Instead, some countries are more vulnerable to the resource curse than others. Those countries seem to be the ones who have relatively weaker systems of governance at the time of becoming resource rich. And here the idea is that countries with robust political institutions are more likely to be able to navigate the tricky challenges posed by resource rents.
Okay. So you need to take good decisions if that rocket is going to head upwards and not down. Right? What generates good decisions? Here's a very simple chart which sets out the map of good decisions. And right at the beginning is a triplet of three different things. Good decisions depend upon good rules. The purpose of rules is to guide you. If you've got to take the same decision again and again, a rule provides you with a bit of guidance, right? Also, if you break the rule, once it's a rule, at least you have to provide an explanation. Sometimes it's sensible to break a rule, but if there's a rule that you're breaking, somebody's going to ask why, and you have to justify it. So rules. Then we need some institutions. And as you'll see, we'll need quite a few institutions. And what are institutions? They're not just rules. Institutions are teams of people. Teams with a mandate that says what they've got to do, and with capacity to do it, but above all, with the motivation to do it. And so a good institution is a motivated team. And then there's a third element in good decisions. The source of legitimacy, both for the rules and the institutions, is ultimately citizens, the citizens of the country. And the citizens need to understand why we need the rules and why we need the institutions, so that they become support for those rules and institutions rather than undermining them. And for that, you need informed citizens. That's true of any good set of decisions. Somebody's got to put in place the rules, the institutions, and the informed citizens. And to put those things into place, who's got to do it? And that's this concept between good decisions and the rules, institutions, informed citizens, the authorizing environment. Who's the authorizing environment in a country? It's the top of government. It's the presidency, the ministers surrounding the presidency, the civil servants surrounding the presidency. That's the authorizing environment. Those people as a team need to ensure the rules, institutions, and informed citizens are put into place. Now, that's true of any set of decisions, but natural resources are really quite complicated. Let's turn to combine that rules, institutions, informed citizens with the decision chain that's required to get good decisions in natural resources. So let's have a look at the decision chain. So this is actually a description of the entire course, the 1-week course, in a nutshell. And there, down the side of the rules, institutions, and informed citizens, and along the top is the decision chain specific to natural resources. You've got to start by understanding the process of exploration, discovery, and licensing. And we've got to turn to that in a moment. Then, as Sunita was talking about, you've got to manage state-owned companies. There's a real danger they become an empire in themselves, a state within a state. Then you've got to manage taxation. If you don't manage the taxation right, you're really in trouble because you won't get any money. Then you've got to work with the local community, get non-tax benefits from extraction as well as tax benefits. And finally, you've got to manage the spending of those revenues. That sounds to be the nice bit. So that's the decision chain, and there's your rules, institutions, and informed citizens that apply to each of them. The course, we cover that entire waterfront in a week in quite a lot of depth. People come out of that course knowing an awful lot more than when they go in. We encourage people to come in teams from the same country. Teams across the civil service, teams across government, journalists, private sector in the country. Because by sending a team back that's been through the same knowledge, you can all support each other in helping to harness these natural resources to guide the rocket better than in the past. So we encourage you to put together teams of 5 or more from the same country to come on the course. In the 2 hours that we got for this Zoom, we're just going to sample. We can't do a short version of the whole thing, we're going to sample. And so we're going to start by sampling the resource discovery process, exploration and licensing. And you may think it's pretty simple here, you just drill holes in the ground or whatever. It's really so far from simple that it's highly complex. And let me start you with a poll question. This table, I want you for a moment to imagine that this table represents the typical square mile of a place I'm going to give you. And I'm going to give you, I'll give you all the high-income countries in the world, the members of the OECD. So put them all together as a piece of geography, all the high-income countries in the world, and take the typical square mile in that vast area of land. How much underneath that square mile is there in terms of valuable natural resources? What's the value of the natural resources? And I'm going to look underneath the table, and I want to tell you how much there is underneath the typical square mile of the high-income economies. And it's about $125,000 as of the millennium. That's a useful date for us because we know that's the figure for the millennium. And of course, we know what's happened since. So as of the millennium, under the rich OECD countries, $125,000 per square mile on average. And now we're going to go to Africa. And we're going to look underneath the typical square mile of Africa. And I'm going to tell you what's under that square mile, but I'm not going to tell you yet. $125,000 for the typical OECD country, France, Britain, wherever, Spain. What's underneath the typical square mile of Africa? And to keep it simple, I'm going to give you a choice. You've got to vote. It could be less than the typical square mile of the OECD countries, and it could be more. Which is it? If you think that it's less than under the typical square mile of countries like Spain and so forth, vote now. Less now. And now, if you think differently, if you think more, vote now, more. In a moment, we're going to count it up. But I want to tell you what the result is for about 10,000 people, because I've asked this question, believe it or not, before. And for those 10,000 or so people, it's running 98% think Africa's got more than the OECD in its typical square mile, and 2% think less. Well, which are right, which are right. In that whole 10,000, there's only one voice that didn't say more or less. And let me tell you, before I give you the answers to our poll, or indeed tell you which answer is right, this guy shouted out, Paul, it's obvious. It's obvious, they're the same. They're the same. Nobody else had said they're the same. That guy was someone called Roger Myerson. He's got a Nobel Prize in economics. And what he'd done very quickly in his head was work out that what must be down there is the result of locally random processes of geology about 60 million years ago. And you've got two huge areas of the Earth, Africa, absolutely vast, all the OECD countries, another vast area. So he said, oh, it's just the law of large numbers. Whatever the number is, the average over two very big samples will tend to be the same. That's right. Underneath these two vast areas, what's there should be about the same. That's not the question I asked. What I asked was really about what had been discovered as the year 2000. So.
You've got 80% more, 20% less.
Okay, so you're doing better than most. Congratulations, because 20% of you got the answer right. The answer is less. Only 80% of you, instead of 98%, got it wrong. That's really about as good as I've ever got, right? So you're a pretty smart audience, but still 80% of you are wrong, right? And the real answer, less, is actually very much less. As of the millennium, $125,000 under the OECD square mile, $25,000 under that Africa square mile. Now, let's extract from that little bit of information two amazing things that, if you're honest, you didn't know until now. And one is that most of Africa's natural resources, as of 2000, hadn't been discovered. It must have at least $125,000, 5 times as much as what it's got. Must have at least that. Most probably a lot more, because as a millennium, the OECD hadn't discovered everything that it's now got and will find. So that's one, that's the good news. is that most of Africa's natural resources, as of 20 years ago, were still undiscovered. And that's probably still true. But there's some bad news in that. And that is that for some reason, so much less had been discovered in Africa than in the OECD, despite the fact that there was the same amount there. And so something had gone very badly wrong with Africa's resource discovery process. And so we better find out something about this resource discovery process. In a Zoom, we can't do much, but we can do something. And so what we're going to do is turn to one of our top experts on the course. And he's the head of resource discovery process prospecting for BP. And he's giving his services for free. And he's a real clear expert. So let's learn from him, Dan Fletcher, about the resource discovery process. Dan, over to you.
Hello, I'm Daniel Fletcher. I work for BP as the Area Development Manager for West Africa. In this session, I'm going to take us through enhancing discovery. I'll cover the key steps of the resource discovery and appraisal process and the link to maturity of data, as well as the key policy decisions around exploration licensing. This is just a taster of what's covered in the larger course, where we'll go into more detail and look at certain case studies, as well as offering you all an opportunity to ask questions directly. I do hope to whet your appetite for that larger course. Firstly, we'll cover an overview of the resource value chain and the link to uncertainty and risk. We'll then touch on licensing policy, covering how this is very much a required partnership between governments and investors. And finally, we'll touch on license timing, phasing, and data management, and the balance between incentivization and risk and reward. I'm just going to bring up a slide that gives an overview of the resource value chain from prospect to grave. This slide shows the value chain for oil, but it's a similar concept for gas and other resource. You can see the rate of resource production on the bottom chart relative to the investment required on the top. From the beginning stages on the left, when an opportunity has been identified pre-access, through to exploration involving prospecting, through to development, production, and abandonment. And you can see that the largest investment comes at the development stage, or sanction. But there's also a requirement for significant investment in exploration and appraisal. And that's a stage where there is significant risk for the investor, and any money spent is write-off effectively. Now, a host government can look to extract value in the exploration stage, which we'll cover a little later, but the vast majority of value is achieved for both the nation and the investor at the production stage. A very important consideration is uncertainty. Now, uncertainty evolves from access all the way through to abandonment. It never goes away, but it is most pronounced at the exploration and access stage. Even at discovery, there is significant uncertainty on recoverable volumes. Uncertainty must be managed effectively to ensure that the promise to nations and investors is delivered. We can reduce the level of uncertainty with geological data. And if we've adequately defined the uncertainty with data, it allows us to manage the associated risk. You can see that at the exploration stage, prospective resource may not be there at all. At the appraisal stage, discovered resource may be more complex than originally thought. And at the development stage, appraised resource may not be developable. At the production stage, developed resource may not be able to be produced, or it might be produced uneconomically, or potentially unoptimally. All of these stages require data to reduce the uncertainty at each of them. And that requires an appropriate work program, which has an associated cost. As you think about the discovery and licensing process, think about uncertainty and risk, particularly about what policies may or may not support the party with whom the bulk of the risk sits in managing that risk. Let's next think about the fundamentals of the discovery process. Exploration fundamentally starts with imaging the subsurface. we need to know the architecture of the subsurface. Not only can this make a discovery more likely, but in the event of a discovery, the more we know about the subsurface, the more we can reduce the uncertainty and support an optimal development decision. We do this through acquiring seismic data. Firstly, 2D seismic data, which gives a regional coarse understanding of a potential prospective area. We can then zoom in on the prospect with 3D seismic and provide more definition that defines whether something is worth drilling or not. But really, the only way to fundamentally know what is down there, to test the rock and fluid, is to drill at a specific location. And in the event of a discovery, it might require more appraisal drilling or other appraisal data, such as production data or a drill stem test, to determine whether that discovered resource is developable or not, or indeed, if it is developable, to inform the optimal concept and development timing. Another factor to consider is the maturity of data. Maturity can really impact risk. Here on this slide, we've got two images of the same oil field, one from 1977 on the left, which is imaged using 2D data, and one from 2010 on the right using 3D seismic data. You can really see that what looks like a very simple structure on the left there is actually rather complex when we image it in a more accurate fashion. If you were to develop something based purely on the 1977 data, you might produce something that's uneconomic, or your development might be suboptimal. Whereas using that 2010 data, you can see where the faults in the subsurface lie, and that can really help you define how best to develop that resource. Another thing to think about is that even in existing discoveries, the success of a prospect very much requires multiple elements, all coming together, which all carry risk. In fact, typically, in proven plays, success is around 1 in 5. And in frontier plays, it's actually more like 1 in 10. And that risk sits with the investor. And hence why it requires a partnership between host governments and the investor for the balance of risk and reward to work for both parties. This example that you can see here is a classic example of why appraisal data is needed. North 1 was drilled as a well first and found economic gas, thermogenic gas. If you look at the seismic data, you might suspect that South 1 is a continuation of that same structure. But in actual fact, when South 1, as an appraisal well was drilled, it found residual biogenic gas, which, as you can see in the bottom picture here, substantially reduced the amount of gas available to develop. Now, if you'd have developed something based purely on North 1, you would have ended potentially with either an uneconomic development or at least at best a suboptimal development. Hence why it's very important to ensure that you acquire adequate appraisal data prior to sanctioning a development. We've touched on the level of resource uncertainty, and reducing that uncertainty and defining the associated risk does require an appropriate work program, which takes time and can be costly. So as we think about policy and licensing, consider the costs and incentives need to be proportional to the level of risk an investor is taking on, as well as the investor's ability to manage that risk. We'll touch on this in the next video.
So thanks, Dan. We'll get back to you. Just to highlight a couple of things that came out of that. One is that even when you get enough information to say, okay, now we've got a drill, the chances of that well finding something that's commercially viable are just, do you remember the number? It was 1 in 10. For every hole that's commercial, there are going to be 9 holes drilled that are uncommercial, or there's nothing there at all. And so that 10th hole, the company's got to be confident that the deal that it's concluded for that 10th hole will pay for all the other 9. Otherwise, that company is heading for bankruptcy. And that means that the company has got to make a profit on that hole to cover the losses on the other 9. Right? That's the bitter reality of resource discovery. It will only go where it's confident that a deal is being struck that enables that. Otherwise, there'll be no drilling, there'll be no search. That's one point. But the larger point is Dan started by emphasizing uncertainty. And uncertainty is a killer. Companies' investment strategies have to be approved by boards of directors. And boards of directors basically will not approve much money at all if there's no data. Because it's just a moonshot. You know nothing, it might work, might not. Companies with boards that say, just let's fire moonshots, usually go bankrupt. And so the big resource companies, their boards are composed of people who are required to ask questions, what are the numbers? And so what Dan was really showing is how investment in geological data gradually turns uncertainty into something that's a quantifiable risk, a probability. And that's half of the process of getting to a company to come and spend money on drilling, is getting enough geological data for that. That's going to require an institution to gather that data. The other half is the political risk that the company faces of whether the deal will be torn up. And so a company is going to be navigating on those two fronts. What is the geology risk and what is the political risk? And that's very important for a government itself to understand. Let's now go back to Dan.
We're now going to touch on the exploration licensing process. At a broad level, acreage containing potential resource is licensed to an investor. Regardless of the mechanism for now, we'll cover that in a bit. Of that acreage, a number of potential prospects are identified, and of those prospects, it's likely that only a small subset are worth testing through drilling. And as we touched on earlier, the chances are that most of those prospects will not yield a discovery, and perhaps only one discovery ends up being developable. So let's think about some of the factors that investors are thinking about when accessing acreage. It's very much a balance of risk and reward. Fundamentally, the investor needs to know that they can extract value from the potential resource. So number one thing that investors are potentially looking at is usually terms. They're also looking at operability, whether they can operate perhaps from an environmental perspective, perhaps the maritime conditions. And many investors are also thinking about the strategic fit of particular acreage or a particular nation in their portfolio. Just because an investor does not access acreage in your nation does not necessarily mean that that acreage is not prospective. Increasingly, investors are looking at the phase of potential hydrocarbon, at least. In the case of oil and gas and lower carbon hydrocarbons are becoming more attractive now with the low carbon nature of the resource. Investors also are thinking about the data available. They want to look at the data that describes what's there already and what they then may need to acquire in addition to that. So having access to open data is rather important, and we'll touch on that in more detail in the next video. They're also thinking about whether there's a market for the product. They're looking at the cost and commitment level, particularly relevant to the risk. And of course, they're thinking about the license timing and phasing, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail in the next video. And they're thinking about stability, political stability. They want to know that they can operate without things changing while they are conducting activity in a particular country. And how about host governments? What are they looking at? Well, governments are fundamentally looking for investors who can explore and develop quickly, efficiently, cheaply, and safely. They're looking for an effective and responsive stewardship of their resources, and they're looking fundamentally to obtain a large share of the economic rent. They might be looking to regulate the pace of development and production. They may be looking for security of energy supply or local investment. They might be looking for an investor with technical expertise or financial muscle who can prove that they would be able to develop the resource that they potentially discover. They're looking to put risk and cost onto the investor. I would say large investors can spread risk across a portfolio of opportunities and countries more effectively, and those larger investors have the ability to manage risk on behalf of the host government due to their financial stability and portfolio. So that's something to think about when awarding acreage to a particular company. So what are some of the different mechanisms of awarding acreage? Well, firstly, there's license rounds. These are often held on a regular basis, often pre-announced and open to all, but they can be restricted. Pre-qualification criteria can be set to ensure that companies have the capability to conduct activity. And license rounds typically involve some kind of bidding process. On one end of the spectrum, we have the US Gulf of Mexico, where licenses are awarded to a company purely on the highest cash bid. And on the other end, we have the UK and Norway, where we have a pure work program, where a bid comprises of a work program to acquire geological information over one or more phases. Or it can be a combination, like in Angola. And then there are out-of-round direct negotiations between an investor and a government. And this can sometimes make sense at the frontier stage when the level of risk is highest. It's also important to note that investors can come in through farm-in to other investors. And in fact, licenses are often held by multiple investors to reduce the risk exposure. But it could be that another investor may come in and take some or all of the equity of an existing leaseholder, and that might come at a cost, for instance, carrying the investor through the cost of a work program. And then, of course, there are corporate takeovers. I would say the framework for what content should be in a bid is important for defining how value can be extracted for the host government. And that's during the exploration and discovery process, but also beyond. And having clear specifications and application requirements are very much in the host nation's interest. So what might a best practice entry process look like? Well, the most important thing is to have a transparent process from the start. Firstly, having data readily available to view and evaluate can really help investors plan budgets, staffing, and timing, and it can help incentivize participation and enable a tangible proposal from an investor. We'll go into that in more detail in the next video. Having clear requirements for the application for things like license timing, phasing, work program, commitments, bonuses, PSC terms, and qualification requirements can all help an investor and government establish if they have an effective partnership. And pre-qualification, for example, can establish whether a company has got the financial and technical expertise to conduct the activity necessary to explore and then develop. A clear bid evaluation methodology is also important. And of course, the process shouldn't change whilst it's underway. An example of how it can go wrong I have is Libya. So Libya had a transparent bid process, but they had a single bid criteria for evaluation, which was government take. The winners bid a greater than 100% government take, but these were companies without the technical or financial capability to conduct any work, and hence their business model was not to find and develop resource. Those with the capability to develop won't probably win on a government take or outlandish work programs. So this needs to be considered in the evaluation methodology. We'll touch more on the specifics of license timing, phasing, and data management, and how this can optimize value in the next video.
Thanks, Dan. So let me again pull out just a couple of points from that. So the Libya story, where the winning company bid that the government would get more than 100% of the value, was obviously crazy. Right? The company had no capacity to do that. So whatever was going on, it was really just trying to get rid of the competition in the bidding process and then sit down and do a renegotiation. And that's very, very bad news. Right? Auctions make a lot of sense, but only if you pre-screen so that all the competitors in the auction are serious players, serious companies with the technological and financial ability to actually do what they say, and the reputational risk that if they don't, they'll lose a lot. As long as you do that, auctions make a lot of sense. And I'm going to tell you a story of where an auction made a difference. And this is an auction that ended up being run by the British Treasury. The British Treasury prides itself on being the finest Ministry of Finance on earth with the greatest expertise. And so what they were trying to assess the value of was not a natural resource discovery. It was the licensing of the 3G mobile phone network. And so the Treasury decided they would work out what the value was. And they figured out that it was worth £2 billion. Sounds a lot of money. And so they said, that's the price. Is there a company around that's willing to pay as much as £2 billion for the 3G mobile phone network? And they found a company came forward and they started just negotiating the detail with them. And at that stage, I'm pleased to say an Oxford economist, it wasn't me, went to the Treasury and said, you're doing it really wrong. You need to run an auction and here's how to do it. And the only amazing part of this story is the Treasury listened. And so the Treasury ran an auction. And now I'm going to turn to you because you're going to tell me what came out of that auction. There was a bid, and I'm going to give you a choice as to how much the winning bid was. And you can see the range of choices. Pick one now, please. And we'll hear what it is in a moment. What are people saying?
A range 2.2 to 4 billion. We've got a lot of 4 to 6 billion.
2.2 to 4, 4 to 6.
A lot of 6 to 10, 23%,
Oh,
6 to 10.
quite a lot of 6 to 10 as well. So it's 2 to 4, 4 to 6, 6 to 10. Anybody gone for the more than 10, the wild option?
19 or 20%?
About 20% went for the wild option, more than 10 billion. Well, once again, the 20% is right. Sort of. I'll tell you how much they got. Remember, they were about to sell it for 2 billion. What they got for it through an auction was 20 billion. Yeah? So the British Treasury, with all its fantastic expertise, was out by a factor of 10 in valuing something as straightforward as a 3G mobile phone network. Imagine what your Ministry of Finance or your Ministry of Natural Resources is going to do with estimating the value of some natural resource, right? That may or may not be exploitable, right? Hopefully, you'll do better than Britain's Ministry of Finance, but the real lesson is in the proper structure. Once you're pre-screened, trying to get to an auction to flush out value is sensible because companies that are well informed are competing with each other, and that flushes out the true value. So all this is getting complicated. Let's for a moment go back to Dan.
We're now going to cover some thoughts on license timing, phasing, and data management, and how this links to incentivizing participation and enhancing the discovery process. Firstly, Let's think about the timing needed to conduct a work program necessary to underpin a development decision in the event of a discovery. License terms need to allow for enough time for the exploration and appraisal activity required to support a development decision, but also not be so long as to encourage an operator to sit on a license. As you can see from this table, planning, acquiring, processing, and interpreting a 3D seismic survey can take over 3 years, and this is before any prospect is even identified. An initial 3-year exploration term is not right for somewhere with no existing 3D seismic data, and it can take a further year to plan and drill an exploration well. And this is before any appraisal activity. So additional time needs to be available after a discovery to appraise. Otherwise, there may be inadequate time to reduce the level of uncertainty needed to invest in a development. You can also see the cost of each of these activities, which can be substantial. License phasing is one possible mechanism to manage the balance between pace and risk. It can help spread risk, commitment costs, and encourage a technically robust work program. If you look at this slide, this shows the 2018 process that was implemented in the UK. It's a great balance between pace and risk. You can see that there are 3 phases to the initial term of up to 9-year duration total, and that depends on the technical complexity and risk, with increasing activity costs in each phase. There are financial and technical tests to pass for the investor to progress from phase A to B and to C, and this can be a way to encourage smaller explorers to participate in phase A, or academia, who may bring new, fresh ideas and can farm down to a company who can develop by phase C or the second term. This supports multiple business models and encourages participation across the industry from small players to large companies with the capability to develop. You can see that in the event of a discovery, there is adequate time to appraise, up to 6 years, again, depending on complexity. One of the key things that investors are looking at in the early stages of access is the cost of evaluation and entry. It's important to consider this when thinking about how to encourage license applicants from across the industry. Data accessibility and availability varies between nations. Fundamentally, there are 2 models. Open file data, where the data is available for anyone to view, and that's sometimes after a set period of time, or limited purchasable data. And of course, you can combine the models. For example, you could have a regional 2D dataset openly available while other data is closed. Open file data can make the most sense when the province is data rich. It incentivizes growth and increases the number of investors participating. And a great example of this is Australia, where their basic geological data becomes open file after 3 years and interpreted data after 5 years. This creates a great balance between pace of activity and those who have taken the initial point of taking the data get that advantage, but only for a few years. And it also incentivizes wider industry participation. I'd say high data cost pre-entry can be a real discouragement to investors, and it could lead to a lack of interest. And there are examples such as in Gabon, where entry cost for was a licensing of a 3D seismic survey at a cost of $30 million. And of course, no one entered. This brings us on to the importance of data management. As I mentioned, having a base of geological data available can attract interest, but investors need to be able to trust that data. An effective management of a national resource data is critical. It's a valuable asset and it can be used to incentivize activity or sold, but it must be managed well to have value. Think about having one government entity managing this, for example, a regulator or national oil company. And think about the specifications of how data should be managed once obtained by an investor. For example, copies of reports, not just the basic data. Digitization has made things easier, but you do still need to think about the physical storage, for example, for rock and fluid samples. It can also be valuable to think about public funding to establish good data management, and it's relatively low cost. Let's have a look at some examples where public geological information has yielded value. Well, in 2018, there was a licensing round where participation was incentivized through funding of a survey the year before. The UK government funded it and it was made freely available to industry and academia. And a mining example, in Northern Ireland, a government-funded initiative between 2004 and 2007 completed surveys over a 14,000 square kilometre area, and within 12 months of the data launch in 2007, the area of Northern Ireland licensed for exploration increased from 15% to 70%, and the subsequent private sector investment in exploration now exceeds over £32 million. Other ways of incentivizing or encouraging initial interest can be participation at industry roadshows or running an effective data room. And in fact, data room processes can even be tendered out, which I believe Mexico did do. Well, that brings this session to an end, and I'd like to finish by highlighting 3 key takeaways for you. Firstly, exploration is a risky business. It's got to be a partnership between governments and investors, and reducing that uncertainty and defining the risk comes with a cost, and costs and incentives need to be proportional to the level of risk an investor is taking on. Secondly, having a robust, transparent entry process and getting the cost of entry right, including accessibility to well-managed data, is critical for incentivizing participation from industry and creating long-term value. And thirdly, the timing and phasing of exploration licenses does need to be carefully considered. The license duration needs to allow enough time to conduct activity necessary to support a development decision, and the optimal phasing of license availability needs to balance risk, prospectivity, local capacity, and market phasing. Thank you very much for listening. I do hope to meet many of you on the course.
Thanks, Dan. You know, following this on a Zoom is really hard. Dan's talk was packed full of information. This is why you need to come on the course, because we then have Dan here for an afternoon. We all interrogate him. He works with us. And we come to understand this. But what we can do, and we will do, we're recording all this as one session. You'll get that recording and you can go through it 2 or 3 times to try and pick up more of what he was saying, because there's a lot of really valuable gems there. I hope that one of the takeaways so far is that discovery, managing discovery, is really quite complicated. If you think you've got to the bottom of complexity, we're still, as it were, scratching the surface. But let's go one more layer down, because COVID, the shock of COVID, has created a further layer of uncertainty about what is going to happen to the oil price and whether the fall in commodity prices has pushed existing projects into unviability. There's a danger of some very, very aggressive conversations between companies and governments, in which governments are very understandably saying, we're desperately short of money, we've lost a lot of revenue, we need to get more out of you, and the company's saying, we've lost a lot of revenue too because of the fall in prices. If you don't ease the terms you've given to us, we'll walk. How credible is that threat? Let's go back to David Manley and hear what he's got to say about this. He explicitly addresses that problem.
Hello, my name's David Manley. I'm a senior economist with the Natural Resource Governance Institute. And today I want to talk about the recent crash in oil prices from the pandemic and the implications this has on taxing oil and gas companies. So I'm going to cover 3 parts. First, to look at oil price forecasts, what the oil price might do in the future, the impact on operating undeveloped and undiscovered oil projects, and the implications all this has for tax policy. So let's first look at oil price forecasts. This chart here shows the oil price since the year 2000 up to the present day. And you can see the recent crash in prices. And the first thing to note is in relative terms, the change is rather small. There was a much bigger change in 2008 following the financial crisis, and also a large drop in prices in 2014. But still, the change is quite significant. And there's a lot of uncertainty going forward over what the price will be. these three forecasts show some of this uncertainty. So the orange line there shows the forward price. So this is the aggregated view of all the oil traders in the world. And the aggregated view suggests that in 2025, the price of oil will be around $50 a barrel. The blue line there shows a scenario forecast by Rystad, a consultancy on oil and gas. And they think the price will be much higher, by 2025, almost to $120 a barrel.
Right, we're a bit behind.
JP Morgan, an investment bank, has an even more extreme view. By 2025, they think the price of oil will be $190 a barrel. So all three forecasts have some consensus that the price of oil will rise from what it is now to something in the future. It's important not to rely on any single forecast. So this chart here shows the oil price again, and in the red lines here show the forecasts by the World Economic Outlook, a publication by the IMF. And the IMF is full of a lot of great, intelligent economists. They have a lot of resources and a lot of data to go on. And you can see their forecasts, in every case, have been completely wrong. They failed to forecast the great boom in prices as China consumed a lot of the world's oil. They failed to forecast the drop in prices after the financial crisis and the Great Recession. And they also failed to forecast the drop in prices in 2014. Now, we can't single out the IMF. Most forecasts are wrong. And the point here is just not to rely on any single forecast when thinking about oil policy and particularly tax policy. It's always better to think about the large range of uncertainty and, importantly, to plan for that uncertainty. And again, in aggregate, all the major oil companies believe that the price will rise over the next 5 years. But again, there's quite a lot of discrepancy over by how much. Recent calculations that we've looked at shows that if the world is going to meet the Paris Climate Agreement and restrict global temperature rises to below 2 degrees, then the long-term oil price will have to be somewhere between $40 and $50 a barrel. So that's what we can say about the oil price in the future. What's the impact on operating undeveloped, undiscovered oil projects? So let's first look at currently operating projects. So the chart on the left shows the drop in total production of oil and gas in 19 countries we either work in within an RGI or that have been interesting to observe. On the whole, the drop in production from 2019 to 2020 has been relatively mild, only about 5%. Why is this? Well, one reason is shown in the chart on the right. Now, in theory, companies will only shut down projects when the operating costs, so the cost per barrel of extracting oil, and the taxes on each of those barrels is more than the price. What we've done here is charts the average operating costs and the average taxes per barrel across all these countries and compared this with the price around $40. In every case, on average, operating costs and taxes are much lower than the current price. So this shows why there's been very little drop in actual production. It also shows that one of the major cost components for companies is taxes. And in some cases, the taxes are much larger than operating costs. But for tax policy, the important implication of this is currently operating projects probably don't need tax breaks. They'll be continuing to operate even with low prices. So we've taken all the projects that are that could be developed over the next 5 years across those 19 countries we've started to look at. Let's zoom down just an example into Algeria. And here there's about 12 projects that could start over the next 5 years. We can take those projects and chart them in this way. This chart shows along the bottom, along the x-axis, cumulative production per barrel per day. And along the y-axis, along the vertical axis, shows the break-even price. Now, the break-even price is effectively a measure of the costs of the company, the cost per barrel of each of these projects. And it's the average price over the life of each of the projects that project needs to break even, so the companies can recover all their costs and to pay back their financiers, to pay back their debt, and to give dividends to their equity investors. But in simplistic terms, the height of those bars effectively shows the price that these projects need to be viable. If companies think the price will be much lower than that, though they're unlikely to invest in them. So by arranging these projects in this way, we can see what the impact of low price expectations are. And we've charted both the current price and the forward price. Projects far to the right with very high costs are going to be the least likely to be developed if companies think prices are going to stay low. It's projects in the middle that require a bit more examination. These projects could be viable, or they could be made viable with some sort of tax break. But it's difficult to actually tell. We've made this chart using estimates of the break-even prices, but these are just estimates. And over time, these costs will change as the design of these projects changes and as conditions on the ground change. So it's easy for us to show this, but in reality, for governments to judge whether they need to reduce or increase taxes, they need to do more work and have greater care over looking at the costs and modeling these projects. We can think about this in terms of a more holistic take. So what we've done here for each of these countries is show the share of production coming from operating projects in grey, upcoming projects with break-even prices below $40, and so therefore probably not much at risk of being delayed or cancelled. And then increasing risk from going from yellow, orange to red of projects with much higher break-even prices. So in almost all cases, the great majority of oil and gas production over the next 10 years will be coming from currently operating projects. And as we've shown, it's unlikely these are going to shut down given the low prices. However, some countries, what we call the new producers, Uganda, Senegal, and Guyana, a lot of their production in the future is coming from projects with a break-even price between $40 and $60 a barrel. So there's a much greater chance that these projects could be delayed, or the companies will lobby government for tax breaks to make these projects viable.
Thanks very much, David. So let's go back to our master matrix of the chart of the whole course, because we've now covered samples of everything about exploration, rules, and institutions. Before we leave exploration and licensing, we're going to go to this box in the bottom, building an informed citizenry. And that sounds a bit like motherhood and apple pie. And it's very, very much more serious than that. There's a whole concept about that now, because so much goes wrong right at the discovery stage in terms of building an informed citizenry. It's got its own term now. It's called the pre-resource curse. You get cursed even before you get the resource out of the ground. It's as bad as that. Let's hear from Jim Cust, who really was the pioneer of the whole concept of the pre-resource curse. Jim, over to you again.
So what is the pre-resource curse? Well, all the studies that I've described have looked at what happens when countries start exporting resources, or when they start getting a lot of government revenue from those resources, basically after production begins. But we wanted to see if these problems might begin sooner. For example, as soon as a new discovery is announced, which might be 5 or even 10 years before the money starts flowing into government. So this idea was pretty controversial among economists. Many said that nothing can happen until the money starts, since it's simply an announcement about the future. Other research suggested that agents might actually respond to this news, and instead they might update their beliefs about the future of the economy. And so this can lead to changes in behavior. So if you believe that there's going to be higher GDP, increased output in the future, then you might consume more today, anticipating lower taxes in the future, and therefore feeling generally richer even before the money has actually started to arrive. Every year there are major discoveries of oil and gas deposits around the world. Government officials and citizens alike tend to be jubilant at the prospect, anticipating prosperity that these discoveries can herald. But we found in our research that this exuberance can often be misplaced. So it turns out in many cases, especially in countries with weaker political institutions, the growth forecasts can be very rosy. So to determine whether a country captures the positive potential of a major oil and gas discovery, we were interested in looking at two comparisons. So the first was whether the growth in the country was higher on average after a discovery than before a discovery. But then we were also interested in whether this growth keeps pace with the forecasts that the IMF are making, implying what they think the new growth path should be, taking into account this discovery. So on both counts, the picture's not good. Growth on average systematically lags behind IMF projections. And for some countries, it's even lower after a discovery than it was before the discovery. So this picture isn't simple, however. We see that in some countries that have strong political institutions, the IMF predict that growth will increase following a discovery, and indeed growth does increase modestly, or at least is not lower than it was before.
So that's the pre-resource curse potentially messing up the economy. It can also, and perhaps even more important, mess up the politics. And to see that, we're going to come back to Britain. Remember, the country with the finest Ministry of Finance in the world? Well, we discovered oil in 1966, having started to search for it only 2 years earlier. So politically, what happened? Well, this happened. What's going on here? Well, where was the oil discovered, first of all? It wasn't discovered in Scotland. It wasn't discovered in England either. It was discovered in the North Sea, more or less the middle of the North Sea. But more of it was off the coast of Scotland than off the coast of England. There was a little political party that had no members of parliament in Scotland, and that party was called the Scottish Nationalist Party. It was a complete political irrelevance. And then in 1966, it hit, when we discovered oil off the coast of Scotland, it hit on a political slogan. It said, "It's Scotland's oil." And who was the Prime Minister? Not in 1966, but by the 1980s, it was Margaret Thatcher. And so they took aim at her and they said, no wonder she's laughing. She's got Scotland's oil. And that became politically incredibly successful. So by 6 years ago, the Scottish Nationalist Party, which before the discovery of oil had been nothing, was so successful that they forced a referendum in Scotland on whether Scotland should secede from Britain, and got 45% of the votes in Scotland. So we've been a union since 1707. So Britain's been a country, united country, for over 300 years. That's one of the oldest countries in the world. But oil, pretty well, and may still tear the very country apart. I should say that one of the members, people who came to attend this course, was the head of his country's civil service. And he told me the biggest mistake we made in the whole governance of our natural resources, because it was a new resource discovery, the biggest single mistake we made was on this issue of communicating to citizens early enough to whom the resources belonged. But he learned on the course how to do it because we taught him the example not only of how to do it wrong, which was Britain, but how to do it right. And to learn how to do it right, we go back to Botswana. And there in Botswana, before they found the diamonds, the president, Sir Paul, who's my hero for Nobel Prize in Public Policy, Sir Paul went round all the clan leaders in Botswana. Botswana was a clan-based society, and each clan had a territory, and he went around and said, we're going to look for diamonds. We've probably got them because the neighbors have got them. We don't know where they are. They'll be discovered somewhere, not everywhere. They'll be underneath one clan and not underneath the others. And we need a rule. We need a decision rule. I'll do whatever you want, but you make up your mind. We could have a rule, finders, keepers. Whichever clan it's found under, the clan keeps it. Or we could have a rule, wherever it's found, we're all going to share it. Okay? Now, I want you to put yourself in the position of the clan leader in Botswana. You're leading one of the clans. And you've got to decide what to say to Sir Paul. Do you want a rule, finders keeps it? Whichever clan finds it, if it's yours, yippee. If it's the neighboring clan, that might be problematic for you to explain to your people why you did that. Which would you choose? If you want a finders keepers rule, you vote now. If I find it, I keep it. And if you think that's too dangerous, let's share it, vote now. Yeah? Whilst they're counting the votes, I'm going to tell you how the clan leaders actually voted themselves. They all voted the same way. They all said, oh, the nightmare is if the next door clan finds them, we've got nothing. And my clan members say, you agreed to this? You're an idiot. Right? In fact, you're such an idiot, you're no longer the clan leader. So every single clan leader said, let's share it. What did our people say?
You've got 15% finders keepers, 85%.
85% of you came up with that same answer as the Botswanan clan leaders, right? So you're doing pretty well. And so in Botswana, there's been no trouble. There's been no equivalent to it's Scotland's oil. Right? But if you look around the world, resource secessions and claims of secession based on natural resources are pretty common. So this is dangerous stuff. Let's now move all together from exploration and discovery. If we could just see that master chart once more, if you've got the time. Where are we going to go next? So in the main course, the next thing we talk about is state-owned companies, managing state-owned companies if you've got one. They are potentially very good, potentially very bad. We haven't got time to do that. We haven't got time at all. And so the next place we're going to land is that third column, taxation. And so that's where we're going to talk about now. And before I get into any of our experts, let's have a look. Let's return to that example of Britain and Norway. So first, why is it a very good example? Let's see if we can find a slide of Britain versus Norway. Coming up. So here it is. Who is better at governing their oil resource? Why is this a good comparison? Let's go to the next slide. It's as close as we get to a natural experiment because Norway got half the North Sea oil and gas, and Britain got half the North Sea oil and gas. It was split by chance virtually evenly. So we had the same resource. What did we do with it? Who managed to get most in taxation? Remember the British Treasury, the most fantastic expert treasury in the world, Ministry of Finance, versus those Norwegians. What was Norway? Norway, in the beginning of the 20th century, was the only European country that was still itself a colony. And so at the beginning of the 20th century, Norway was poor, had had a lot of emigration, and it was a colony. Which is going to get the tax system right? Let's have a look. Whoops, there's no mistake here. There's, unfortunately for me, no mistake. Norway managed to get about 3 times as much per barrel in tax as Britain. So you are not necessarily at a disadvantage by not having a lot of expertise in your treasury. You just have to acquire the expertise, learn how to do it. The British Treasury, I think, was so arrogant that it evidently didn't. Right? So that's pretty dismal. Let's now turn to some expertise. There's a poll each year of which tax experts are the most expert in the world. There are 50 of them pulled out as these are the top 50 tax experts in the world. We've got them. We've got one of them. We've got the one that is specialized in natural resource taxation. Ali, over to you.
Mining revenues are critically important to many developing countries. However, mining projects have often tended to underdeliver on expected government revenue. This could be for a variety of reasons: poorly designed fiscal regimes, overly generous tax incentives, weak implementation, as well as companies avoiding paying taxes. Typically, mining fiscal regimes depend on corporate income tax as the primary source of government revenue. Whilst royalties may deliver predictable, early revenues, the lion's share is expected to come from corporate income tax, which is challenging for tax authorities to collect and vulnerable to profit shifting by multinationals. Fighting tax avoidance is necessary to ensure host governments collect their fair share, but it's no easy task, even for well-resourced tax administrations. For instance, only after a multi-year court battle did BHP, one of the world's biggest miners, agree to pay 529 million Australian dollars in a dispute with the Australian tax authorities, which involved a transfer pricing scheme shifting profits from Australia to Singapore. With limited capacity, developing countries are even less well equipped to counter complex tax avoidance schemes, such as transfer pricing, distorted mineral valuations, excessive payments on intercompany loans, and tax treaty shopping. Paradoxically, these same countries are acutely dependent on corporate income tax, which represents almost 19% of all tax revenues in Africa, 16% in Latin America and the Caribbean, compared to just 9% in developed countries, according to the OECD. The IMF estimates that tax base erosion and profit shifting denies developing countries more than $200 billion of revenue per year across all sectors.
Thanks, Ali. Yeah, you heard that right. $200 billion a year that's being lost due to profit shifting and tax avoidance. And even the government of Australia, you heard, had a long court battle to try and offset that. So this is serious stuff. It's very big money. What can you do about it? Ali, back to you.
So, what can resource-rich developing countries do to improve revenue collection within the current system? First, avoid bad or no taxes. Tax incentives and tax treaties are policy choices that have the potential to create additional challenges for revenue collection, especially to the extent that they increase exposure to profit shifting. Avoid tax holidays. Mining is location specific. The resource cannot be picked up and transported to a country with a lower tax rate. It follows that mining investment is less responsive to tax incentives. Use financial modeling to determine the precise fiscal terms required to make an investment viable. That way you won't unnecessarily give away vital tax revenues. Second, simplify your tax system. The challenges of administration, limited resources, mean that the tax system needs to be simple. Consider using benchmark prices, capping costs. Whilst these approaches might mean increasing the tax burden on investors and potentially lowering revenues for government, at least revenue will be easier to collect and more predictable. And government and investors are less likely to end up in costly disputes. Third, work together. Fragmentation of revenue administration is one of the biggest barriers to mining revenue collection. The tax authority and mining ministry need to collaborate, to share information, to share expertise, especially when it comes to verifying mineral prices and mining costs. These measures will help governments to improve mining revenue collection within the current system.
Thanks, Ali. We're going to come back to you in a moment. So keep it simple. One of the adages I like to teach on the course is that if you're going to tax it, build the capacity to observe it. And conversely, if it's very hard to observe, don't try and tax it. Tax something else that is easier to observe. $200 billion a year going astray. Don't give tax holidays. What else can we do? It sounds as if there's something more fundamental that's needed. Ali, final word.
However, are there other policy options that might better maximize government revenues? Should we be rethinking the way governments benefit financially from their mineral resources? The mining landscape is changing. New technologies are increasing the urgency for mining tax reform. The industry is quickly embracing automation, big data, artificial intelligence, which potentially disrupt economic linkages with host countries as mines opt to employ machinery and offshore computer engineers over local workers. As technology transforms mining operations, tax policies need to adapt so that mining's benefits can be equitably shared with host countries. Policymakers need a wider range of options that can be tailored to specific scenarios. Some governments are already turning to measures such as state equity participation, production sharing contracts, like those typically found in the oil sector. Others might look to more flexible tools such as Chile's progressive royalties or simpler rent taxes. Better administrative procedures can guarantee unprocessed minerals such as iron ore and bauxite are exported at market prices. The right policy will depend on domestic resource endowments, international investment frameworks, governance standards, and access to capital. Governments must also play their part by operating with high levels of accountability and financial transparency. What is clear, however, is that pre-existing concerns about under-revenue collection, combined with changes in the industry and financial pressures arising from the current pandemic, all point in the direction of reform. Together, government, industry, and citizens, we need to take a closer look at the future of resource taxation.
So, what do you need to do? Within the country, you need change, and internationally, we need reform. When Ali speaks here, she gives a long session. It's always the top-rated session in our course. And of course, there are just tons of questions. So there's a whole conversation. I'm pleased to say that Ali is such a good citizen that she's going to be here at the end of this Zoom to answer questions, as is Jim Cust. We've selected the two of them, and they've very kindly agreed to be here to answer your questions. So when the Zoom is otherwise finished, we go to questions to you to ask us about the content that you've heard. I make no pretense that it's easy to absorb this just in one rush. If we just go back to a moment, if we can, to our master screen, where have we got to? We've really done as best we can for the moment with taxation. Where would you go on the course next? Well, you'd go to working with the local community and getting non-tax benefits from extraction. Enormously important topics. We haven't got time. We're going to skip right over them. And yet these are not nice to haves. They are absolutely fundamental, both to governments and to natural resource companies themselves. At the moment, a major natural resource company is facing massive damage because something went wrong with one local community in one place. So the downside costs to getting these two sections wrong are enormous, and we go into them in a lot of detail. We're not going to touch them at all. We're going to land finally at that last column, managing and spending the revenues. Now that sounds really nice. It sounds as if we're completely out of the woods. And maybe that's right. In fact, let's see. I'll ask you. So this is a question about where you think the biggest problems with the resource curse occur. Do they occur in all the things we've covered so far, basically discovering and getting the revenues in, or do they occur once you've got the money and you start spending it? So people who think most of the problems are getting the money in, vote now. People who think most of the problems occur once you've got the money in, vote now. And whilst people are adding that up, I'll tell you what I think. And I think that most of the problems of natural resource countries have come from very poor decisions on spending. And I'm going to illustrate that with my own country, Britain. And so we're going to go back to that comparison, slightly painful comparison if you're British, between Britain and Norway. We saw they had the same amount of oil and gas. We saw Norway did a whole lot better on raising taxation. What did they do with the money that they did get in tax? So we're going to have two charts here. The first one is this. Which country actually invested their revenues in assets, whether it be financial assets or infrastructure or whatever? So we've got net national saving as a percentage of gross national income, which is just a fancy wording for how much of this revenue was actually put into assets year by year. And you can see the blue line, Norway, it's nearly always above the red line, Britain, and it tends to be rising. Whereas in Britain, not only is the red line pretty well always below the blue line, but it's falling. So let's see how that accumulates into an asset story. Can we have the next chart? Right, so this is net financial assets as a percentage of each country's GDP. And let's look at the most recent figure, which is 2014 on this chart. And the blue line looks very healthy. Norway had built up huge financial assets. It had also built up a lot of infrastructure, which is not shown here. So Norway had built up one of the biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world. Right? Huge financial assets per person. And now we turn to the red line, Britain. And Britain, you know, it's lower in 2014 than it was in 1980, but it's always in Britain below zero. Norway started out below zero. Below zero means the government has a lot of debts. But Norway first paid back all its debts and then accumulated the sovereign wealth fund. Britain, by 2014, was deep into national debt. And so very different choices. That's the sad story. Do we have any results?
We've got 16% getting it into government revenue and 84% the real problem is how to spend it.
Well, you're doing really well. 84% of you said the real problem is how to spend it. Being British, I feel that very strongly, right? I'd like to replay all that oil again and do it very differently. We can't, right? But you can. If you've got a lot of resources coming out in the future, you've still got a chance to get it right. But it isn't easy, is it? Right? Now we're going to turn to why is it so difficult? Right? And one reason is that the prices of commodities are very, very volatile. You've seen it with the oil price. It goes up, it goes down. And so the revenues from natural resources are very, very volatile. Right? It's very hard to plan a budget that way. And if you just spend as you go, you're going to have periods of intense boom when you spend as if there's no tomorrow, and then periods of excruciating bust where you can't finance anything. Right? So what's the alternative to that? The alternative is to smooth spending through that volatility by saving when prices are high, dissaving when prices are low. It took a surprisingly long time before countries did that. The country which pioneered it was Chile, and the person who built and ran the smoothing fund was a very fine economist called Eric Parado. Eric is now chief economist of the Inter-American Development Bank, and he comes on this course each year, and he is a star of the course because he gives these wonderful, politically informed stories of the struggles faced in Chile in setting this thing up and running it. So let's hear it from Eric. Thank you.
To introduce the topic about managing revenues and investments, I would like to start with a story about St. Augustine. Before being a saint, Augustine lived a very hedonistic life. He committed all types of sins, but one day he realized that he had to change his behavior and convert to God. So one day he knelt and prayed, "Lord, grant me chastity and continence," but not yet. Countries often behave like St. Augustine before he became a saint. They know that a sensible change is probably good, but they don't have the desire or the courage to make that change. This is especially true when policymakers discuss sustainable fiscal policies. Economic authorities and politicians usually agree that being fiscally responsible is the way to go. However, the same people doubt the political benefits in the short term, and therefore they procrastinate over the implementation. Why do they have to change and apply a responsible fiscal policy now if they will not enjoy the benefits immediately? This is what I call the St. Augustine syndrome of fiscal procrastination. Probably the current crisis will be a wake-up call for policymakers to implement now the necessary reforms to have more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable growth and development. Several countries have managed to avoid the St. Augustine syndrome. This has required the prudent management of both fiscal flows and fiscal stocks. On the one hand, a fiscal policy rule has permitted countries to save in good times and to expend extraordinary resources on rainy days. The stabilizing fiscal policy rule has been key to smoothing fiscal expenditure and to avoiding the economic sins present in many countries, deficit bias and procyclicality. On the other hand, the management of fiscal stocks has transformed these countries into examples of resilience and prudence. This sounds easy, but it requires both political courage and economic responsibility. The simple approach implies saving during periods of economic boom and using those accumulated resources during economic slowdowns. Shifting from procyclical to a countercyclical fiscal stance stabilizes both relative prices and economic activity. It also has important long-term effects, helping to smooth public investment and social expenditures across the cycle, and shielding welfare programs and transfer to the poor from the tempers of commodity markets. This is what we need now to offset the COVID-19 shock. For some countries, being prudent is paying off because they save resources in the good times, but other countries are struggling because financial resources are scarce to implement larger fiscal packages to support households and firms. So, in an ideal world, and in order to smooth expenditure flows over time, governments should optimally run surpluses in good times, like in periods of fast economic growth or high commodity prices, and run temporary deficits in bad times, like the economic catastrophe that we are living today. In other words, the budget shouldn't necessarily be balanced every year, but it should be in balance over the business cycle. Fiscal rules usually are complemented by the introduction of vehicles for managing the surplus resulting from the application of the policy rule. These are the so-called sovereign wealth funds. Depending on the country, the objectives could be different. In most of the cases, the objective is to finance fiscal deficits that may occur during periods of weak economic growth or low commodity prices. In this way, it helps to reduce cyclical variations in fiscal spending, ensuring long-term financing of social programs, and those are the typical stabilization funds or rainy days funds. In other cases, these type of funds are designed to help meet fiscal obligations for pensions and social security, and in other cases are just vehicles for constant streams of returns to finance the budget. Investments of the resources require a good corporate governance and a clear and transparent institutional framework that provide the necessary structure to make and implement decisions, monitor and control risk, and for the purpose of investment policy. There are many options regarding the corporate governance of sovereign wealth funds. There are some countries that have schemes in which the Ministry of Finance, together with the central bank, manages the resources. Here we can find the cases of Botswana, Chile, and Norway. And in some other cases, there are independent institutions dedicated exclusively to invest those resources. Here we have the cases of China, Korea, and Nigeria, among others. Regarding investment policy, this will depend on the objectives and investment horizon of the funds. For instance, in the case of stabilization funds, the investment policy should maximize the value of the fund to partially cover cyclical downturns in fiscal income, subject to low level of risk. This risk aversion is reflected in the selection of an investment portfolio of high liquidity, low credit risk, and low volatility, allowing for timely injection of resources to finance fiscal deficits and at the same time avoiding significant losses in the value of the fund. Other funds with longer term horizons should accept more volatility, so investment policies may include larger proportion of equities, corporate bonds, and even alternative investments like real estate. An important consideration regarding the investment policy is not only the type of asset class to choose, but the place to invest. For instance, several funds invest all resources outside the country and in foreign currency. The rationale for this is twofold. On the one hand, investment in foreign currency entails a natural hedge because of the usual negative correlation between commodity prices and the nominal exchange rate. In other words, the government saves when the commodity price is high and the local currency is strong, and in contrast, it is safe when the commodity price is low and the local currency is weak. On the other hand, investing all the resources abroad helps to stabilize the real exchange rate. Specifically, the fact that all commodity revenues are usually in US dollars may have a destabilizing effect if these resources are converted to local currency. Among other reasons, it would put strong pressures on asset prices, including a substantial appreciation of the exchange rate with the subsequent negative consequences for other exports. In sum, this feature avoids the so-called Dutch disease. Of course, there are other funds that invest domestically, like investment in infrastructure or in national companies. This could be an option, but this will require not only good corporate governance, but also a careful consideration in terms of the capacity absorption of the economy. An additional consideration regarding the investment policy is about sustainable investments. The conventional wisdom is based on the idea of a trade-off between sustainability and low financial returns. New evidence considering sustainable investments based on ESG benchmark provides a different conclusion. Better investments also have better or at least similar returns than the usual benchmarks. So countries should also consider this type of investments if they are looking for inclusive and sustainable growth and development. Another important point that I would like to consider in this presentation is transparency. To be like San Agustin, countries need not only to avoid procrastination, but also to be transparent. The establishment of sovereign wealth funds should be aligned with a clear commitment to transparency in the management of the funds. The motivation shouldn't only be transparency as a goal per se, but as a factor supporting the legitimacy of the savings process. In this context, as part of countries' commitment towards transparency, funds around the world have adopted a broad agreement on the best principles and practices for sovereign wealth funds. This agreement is known internationally as the Santiago Principles. At the end of the day, a prudent fiscal framework with transparency and credibility can give countries very good results. The complete cycle of savings and the spending process legitimize the use of sovereign wealth funds around the world. For instance, given the magnitude of the current crisis, 24 governments have used or have announced intentions to withdraw resources from their sovereign wealth funds. The withdrawals from Norway's NBIM and Singapore's GIC are significant, but the situation is more critical in emerging markets, including Africa and Latin America, where some funds may get exhausted altogether. Most withdrawals are from stabilization funds, honoring their mandate, but this shouldn't be seen as a problem. On the contrary, the expected value of stabilization funds in the long term should be zero. But of course, everything will depend on the duration of the crisis. In any case, the good results of some sovereign wealth funds have led other countries to consider or to implement sovereign wealth funds in order to impose greater fiscal discipline while, at the same time, providing self-insurance in a volatile world. Implementing a prudent fiscal policy framework enables a country to sustain social expenditures over time and consequently foster both economic and financial stability. This requires political commitment and courage from both policymakers and politicians. Without this commitment, they risk suffering from the consequences of the San Agustin syndrome of fiscal procrastination. A couple of final messages for countries that are trying to implement prudent fiscal policies. Stay legitimate, transparent, and simple from day one. This is a daily task. The benefit of these efforts will be reflected sooner or later in the positive assessment by the citizens, the real owners of the resources. That is the true sovereign success. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. So we start with St. Augustine and the recognition of the need for prudence and God make me good, but not yet. And of course, if every politician, every political leader takes that view, you never build any savings up. Eric pointed out a really important additional reason why saving during good times is a good idea. And that is, it's not just useful for when the price of the commodity itself comes down. It's useful if you get some exceptional bad event, such as coronavirus. All around the world, governments are now desperate for money. The ones that built some liquid foreign assets have got those resources. The ones that didn't haven't. So much volatility that it's not, unfortunately, the end of the story about managing the revenues. The next thing we've got to consider, and we'll do them quickly, is depletion. A lot of the discoveries of the last 20 years have been, for example, small oil fields that will last for 10, maybe 20 years if you're lucky. So they're sort of windows. And if you just spend on consumption as you're exploiting those windows, then you get a very hard landing when the resource runs out. I first became really conscious of that in Zambia. I used to go a lot to Zambia, and a lot of Zambian friends. And Zambia is a copper exporting country. And periodically, the world copper price has gone up through the roof. And instead of saving the money, putting it into either domestic or foreign assets, Zambia typically used that opportunity to borrow more and throw a party. And the good times were very good. But I remember my Zambian friend putting his head in his hands and saying, when the copper runs out, what are our children going to say about us? Because we have squandered their future. That was an asset that should have built their future. What are they going to say about us? Huh? I've always remembered that. The happiest old men I ever met in the world were three old guys from South Korea who'd run South Korea's reform program in the 1960s and taken South Korea from a dirt poor country to a very rich one. And think what they say with their grandchildren, right? So much for depletion. It's a fairly obvious point, but there's a further killer. And the person who best spotted it was Sheikh Yemeni. The Sheikh Yemeni, who was the head of OPEC, the oil cartel in the 1970s. And he was thinking about the future price of oil and the future revenues from oil. And he said, you know, the Stone Age didn't end because the world ran out of stone. The Stone Age ended because they discovered something better than stone. And let's go back to copper, Zambia's asset. Will copper just run out? Well, there's an awful lot of copper in the world, so probably it won't. Will we still be using as much copper in 100 years' time? Well, think about it. The main use of copper is in stuff like this, right? Because copper's a good electricity conductor, it's used for the wires inside cables. Do you think in 100 years' time, rooms such as this or cars will be full of wires, of copper wires? Of course not. Of course not. Sometime in the next 100 years, probably sooner rather than later, we'll discover some better way of transmitting electricity, and then the demand for copper will collapse, and with it, the price. I was actually invited to Chile to advise them on natural resource management. I thought there's not much to say. There they are, they're the world best in handling volatility. So then I tried the technology point. Your copper might become obsolete. And my commentator said, you shouldn't have had to come all the way from England to Chile to tell us this, though thank goodness you did, because we've lived through exactly that once before. In the, from about 1880 to 1920, half of government revenue in Chile was coming from the export of natural nitrates. And then in 1920, a German scientist discovered how to make that nitrate synthetically. And so the price of natural nitrates collapsed overnight, never to recover. And so overnight, Chile lost half of government revenue. That's going to happen to copper at some stage. And so all natural resource revenues, not only are they volatile because of price, not only is there a natural time up, we've depleted them, but there's that wild card of obsolescence. So all of these are reasons why you need to save. The question is, save in what? And very briefly, let me set up the choices. So, hopefully you're going to be looking at a slide called Building Long-Term Assets. And it just sets out a simple chain of decisions. And I'm only going to skim through it. In the real course, we go through this carefully and explore all the options. So there's the financial assets abroad, which Eric talked about. Or there's build real assets at home. There's a case for both of them. Eric gave the case for financial assets. The case for real assets at home is if you're a very poor country and you can't borrow anymore, then since you're very short of investment within the country, it's not a bad idea to use the revenues for investment. But then you've got to ask the question, do I have the capacity to invest well? And you have to answer that honestly. In the course, we point you to objective information which tells you the answer to that question, whether you've got the capacity. Sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's no. If the answer is yes, very good, except is the increase in income large and pretty sudden? Because if it is, if this is a big natural resource bonanza, no country on earth can increase spending on domestic investment by, say, more than 20% and keep investment decisions sensible and orderly. And so if it's a big increase, then you have to save. So you have to save abroad. If you don't have the capacity yet, then what should you do? Well, you shouldn't pretend that you have it. And in the short term, you need to park money abroad. So even whether it's a large increase or it's a small increase, but you don't have the capacity yet to invest well, you park the money abroad. But you don't leave it abroad forever, because that parking abroad buys you time to build the capacity for domestic investment. And that building of capacity, I call investing in investing, and it's a really important component of the course. Unfortunately, it's a component we've absolutely no time to cover, and so instead, we're going to go back to the matrix one final time. We've done the managing and spending of revenues, the rules and the institutions. But finally, we're going to look at that final component, building an informed citizenry. Yes, most of the stuff that goes wrong is in spending, and potentially your big ally are citizens in getting it done right, but only potentially, because there's also a potential for citizens to get it radically wrong and become part of the problem instead of part of the solution. So somebody needs to build informed citizenship. And that's a role for leaders as communicators in chief. We've got our final expert, and I'm pleased to say we've got her live in this room. She's the Dean of the Blavatnik School. We teach courses here at the Blavatnik School just on communication by leaders. Nari herself is a world expert on this, who advises some of the top leaders around the world in good communication. But she's here now. And so we're now going to have a conversation about how to do it. Nari, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone who's learning on this session. Let's be really brief as a taster to what senior officials who come to the school learn about. And what I would throw out as a simple guide of 5 core vital rules about communication. And the first of those is, who are you communicating with? Do you actually know the community that you're trying to speak to? There's no point if you're the Minister of Finance going to speak to a village about inflation. You want to know what is their number one concern. And that means that every policymaker has to have a way of listening to that, of hearing it, of knowing how it's expressed in the local language. So rule number 1, who is your audience? What is their major concern? And how do they express that concern in their local language? I mean, just stop and think for a moment. If you hear that a politician is going to give a speech, or even if you hear a government official is going to give a speech, most people go, oh yeah, we know what they're going to say. They're just going to come and give us the usual message, and has every reason not to believe the government spokesperson. So what we're trying to do in these 5 core steps is to think about how you can overcome that, get their attention, and get some and get credibility as a spokesperson. So rule 1, know who they are. Arrive, make that speech fits to your own team and your own agency. Start with the concern that is in people's minds, because that's your way of saying, I know you, I can hear you, I know what you're suffering or worrying about or fearing. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, and this one's hard for politicians and leaders, is being prepared to be honest about what you cannot do. You might be looking at a room full of employees and saying, I know you're all worried about losing your job after COVID-19. And it might be that your step 2, what you can't do, is I can't stand here and promise that every one of you will keep your job. And that is counterintuitive to people that want to come along with their specially crafted message polished by a PR firm and deliver it. Because that step is your trust building step. It's saying, I'm going to be honest with you. So step one, who you're speaking to, what's their concern, voice it. Step two, be honest about what you cannot do to alleviate that concern. Step three is your chance to do what your PR firm probably had you thinking about doing in the first place, which is to lay out your plan. I can't promise you that you'll all have a job, but here is our plan. Here is our plan for the next week, month, year, 3 years. And of course, to be able to lay out your plan, you actually have to have a plan. And if you're sitting there and you're working in a government agency and you're not the person who's going to give the speech, it's the need for a plan that gives you an opening to use your expertise to inform your boss, the head of the agency, your politician, about what kind of plan they can put in front of people and why it is that you need time to put that plan together, or information or support from the top to put that plan together. So step three is, what is your plan? Step four is, how can the people you're speaking to know that you are genuinely delivering on your plan? Now, you might say, well, I'm going to report to them every year. That's not good enough in today's society, where everybody has a mobile phone, they've got access to data. So what is it that they are going to be able to see every week or every month, or perhaps just once a year, that shows that you are delivering on their plan? Maybe you'll be able to say to them, here is our plan. We are doing this training program, reskilling program, and infrastructure program, which will deliver the following number of jobs. It won't employ everybody, but bit by bit, we will employ more people. So at the end of next year, you should see that we have 50 people working on this project. So give people something that they can see independently with their own eyes that shows that you're delivering on the plan. And step five is, what are the sunny up plans? If all goes to plan and all this happens, what is the wonderful future that we can expect working together? So Paul, that's where I would start. 5 simple steps. Who are the people you're speaking to? What is it you can't do for them? What is your plan? Have you really directed your team to come up with a good plan? How is it that people can monitor that you're delivering on it? And what sunny upland is that going to take us towards?
Thanks, Nairi. I should say that during the real thing, not only do you articulate that very, very well, but it's very funny, because you use a lot of illustrations, sometimes of people getting it right, sometimes of it going really quite catastrophically wrong.
Yeah.
So communication is an art which is very seldom linked with strategy. There are a lot of public relations communicators out there, and they're trained to navigate by the day or the week. Whereas our message here is that it's actually got to be used to build a long-term strategy, because with natural resources, they have to be a long-term strategy.
Yeah, I so agree, Paul, because it's something my view has changed on. I used to think that communication was something you did after all the brainy people worked out the policy. And then, you'd forge the policy, get political agreement, and then you'd give it to your communication office and they would go sell it. I've radically changed my view on this by working with agencies, governments, and companies, and realizing that the need for the communicators in chief to communicate is the opportunity for people who want to do serious planning and strategy to get the ear of the communicators in chief and to make sure that the proper planning is done. In other words, if you're a serious person and you want to do serious policy in this area, get involved in communication, because that's where the door is going to open for you to put the best ideas in.
And without that success in communication, the strategy is not feasible. You have to build a sense of common purpose in the society around a long-term strategy, and that's hard. Without the willing compliance of the population around a strategy for using natural resources for the long term, it will be frustrated. The best laid strategy just will fall apart. If we go back to Chile for a moment, which kind of got the Nobel Prize in how to manage volatility, it was a very close run thing. Because despite quite a big effort on communication, it really blew up in their face. We sometimes get the Chilean former Minister of Finance presenting here, and he had to explain to his children when he was taking them to school why he was being burnt in effigy in the street, because people so hated him for not spending all the money when copper prices were high. And he tells the story, he was saved by the fall in the copper price.
Right.
Because he was then suddenly became a national hero, because he was able to say, thanks to all the money we've saved, we can keep on spending. We don't have to go into austerity mode.
So, and I guess I would say that the golden rule for anyone in public policy is to remember that communication is not just about the message. Communication is about who you're speaking to and whether they think that you are listening to them and respect them. That people in an age where communication is so easy have become much more deaf to it. And simply yelling at other people never works. Giving them a stump speech, no matter how beautifully you've crafted it, is not going to work. Because people only really listen if they think they're being listened to. And so, to me, that would be the cardinal rule. And they're not going to continue to listen, first, if they don't believe that you are really going to listen or have listened to them. And second, that you really do have a serious plan, that you're not just another person coming into their community and promising things that are never going to happen. The world is pretty immune to that.
Now, here we are. We've reached the end of the Zoom itself. I want to say this is your opportunity. Soon you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. But above all, it's your opportunity to communicate with other people, try and build a team that can come here next year and actually skill up, actually learn about all this. We've given you a very pallid reflection of what the real thing is like, first and foremost, because you are not befriending and learning from another 50 people in this room for a week. That is the experience which is most inspiring about giving this course. People learn from each other.
Yeah, I think one of the most rewarding moments for me looking at this course has been seeing groups from one country pick up the relationship after they've come on the course and actually travel to each other's countries better to understand how they can do things better, to learn from each other in practice. And it's funny, but in any country, most policymakers believe that there's not a lot they could learn from another country because their problems are singular to their own country. And year after year in this course, we find that officials get a community of peers that really help them to do better when they go home. And I think for me, that's one of the really satisfying things about watching this course, Paul.
Now, in order to be able to come on this course, you need to try and build a team and you need to apply for the course. So now we're going to tell you how to apply for the course. We'll be back in a moment with the questions, but just for this moment, you really need to follow this, how to apply for the course. Otherwise, you're not sitting here next year. So here's the details, right? Executive course, 13th to the 17th of September, 2021. And here's the link you need to click on. We're going to send that round to everybody, of course. We're going to send the whole video of this course, of this Zoom course, and we'd like you to share that with as many people as possible, both in your country and people you know outside your country, but especially try and build a team within your country that can come. Most of the people teaching this course, we give our services for free. So by the standards of courses at fancy universities, this is a very inexpensive course. But we very much hope that I'll see you sitting next year. Some of you will be sitting in the chairs that you can see now. So on that note, we're going to turn to questions. And remember, I'm joined by Ali, the tax expert, and Jim from the World Bank, the pre-resource curse. Feel free to ask us about anything on this course. And any questions that come in, we'll do our best. Right?
So thank you. Thanks so much, Paul. I've been monitoring the Q&A box, so we have plenty of questions. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're really happy to have been able to organize this event from the Natural Resource Governance Institute with BSG, with the Blavatnik School of Government. We will have a few minutes, so I'm going to pick at least one question for each of you, and then we can see how we feel afterwards. So I'll start with a question related to the resource curse. One participant is asking about what countries, Jim, would you say are facing right now a resource curse? And in that sense, what would be your recommendations, your suggestions, ideas, based, of course, on the research you've been carrying out, on what would be the best policies to tackle the resource curse? Thank you.
So,
Thanks, Mike.
Jim, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I'll have a go. Thanks, Paul. So hi, everyone. Great to be here live as well to connect with you all. And thanks for the question. So as Paul mentioned, there's many major discoveries that are happening all of the time. And in particular, these are happening in countries in Africa, which is the region I work on, but all over the world, including in many developing countries. So there are a wide number of countries that actually are facing what we might consider the risk of the resource curse right now. And many of you will be sitting in those countries right now. And so you know better than I do the risks that are being faced. So some examples that we've looked at, in the recent past, countries like Ghana and Mozambique faced some very severe difficulties following their discoveries and really got into quite serious macro fiscal crises before they got to the stage of production. Countries on the horizon that are now, they've had major discoveries, they haven't yet had what we would call a resource curse, but the risk is there, is countries like Guyana that have enormous offshore deposits that they're grappling with at the moment. Countries like Senegal and Mauritania that actually share some deposits that straddle the border, offshore gas deposits between the two countries. And I think here the challenge that we've seen and the sort of risks to avoid, the first is the one around expectations. So expectations can really go wild following discoveries. And so I think there's an important role for government, as Nari laid out, to be very clear in terms of communicating the scale of the opportunity, but also the modesty of the opportunity. This isn't going to transform everybody's life overnight. And so there needs to be a certain amount of sobriety about how long it will take for these projects to come on stream, and then what the prospects are for job creation, for revenue distribution, and so on. And what flows from managing the expectations is then also managing the spending and saving decisions. So what we've seen with the pre-resource curse is you don't have the money yet countries try and spend the money before they've got it. And so this affects the decisions around borrowing. So here, I think one of the big risk factors that we look out for is countries going to the market and borrowing money at commercial rates before the projects have reached the production stage. And so here it's really a case of citizens, governments, other stakeholders coming together and making sure that these decisions really are taken in a sober way and not driven by rampant expectations that might prove to be unrealistic. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. That was great. I mean, one of the little bits of advice I give, President Johnson Sirleaf brought me into Liberia when they were looking for oil, and they'd been given a signature bonus. They got a signature bonus of $50 million. Signature bonus was paid before anything was discovered. Nothing was discovered, and if you think about it, that pretty likely that, remember, you drill a well, and the chances of that well finding something when it's the first well, 1 in 10, right? So there was a 90% chance that all you'd get was this signature bonus, which was $50 million. $50 million reported in a poor country sounds like $50 billion. It just, ordinary people handling a normal budget, $50 million just signals vast. I'm rich, right? You know, I don't need to work anymore. And that leads to a terrible danger. A better way of reporting it would not have been $50 million. It would have been dividing it by the population. That immediately gets rid of the millions. In fact, it gets rid of nearly all the dollars. It comes down to $12 each. Right? So if it had been reported as we got $12 each, nobody would have said, I don't have to work anymore. Right? But because people thought, my God, there's all this 50 million vast, but I'm not seeing it. I'm still having to work. Who's got it? They must be crooks. Right? So, very simple rule. Whenever you report money, divide by the population. So it's so much per person. Shall we go to another question?
Yes. So I have another question that I think Ali could probably answer. So in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, some participants are asking about how governments should act in this difficult, challenging, I would say, situation. So what would be your recommendation in terms of governments being asked by companies to revisit some agreements, to lower taxes, to even renegotiate contracts?
Ali, over to you.
Thanks very much, Margarita, and thanks, Paul, for having me. Oh, you've just lost my video. There we go. Hi, back again. Thanks for the question. So I think I can speak more to the mining sector than oil and gas, which I think David Manley covered very well earlier. So I think the first thing to say is that the mining sector certainly hasn't been uniformly affected by the COVID crisis. Some minerals, some commodities have fared particularly well during this period. Gold is the obvious one. But even minerals that perhaps were impacted negatively at the start have picked up since then. So copper is an example of a metal that price took a dive during the kind of initial months of COVID and has stabilized since then. So the important thing for governments is to really know the sector, to know your commodities that you're dealing with, and to understand what the impacts of COVID have been in relation to those specific commodities. So I think that's the first message that I would give to governments, is that the impact has not been uniform. I think we've seen very limited instances of specific tax relief in the mining sector, partly because I think of all the excellent guidance that many organisations and individuals provided at the beginning. If you're going to issue tax relief, make it economy-wide, don't try and target particular sectors. So certainly mining and oil and gas to some degree have benefited from the general tax relief that countries may have provided, but we've seen very few instances of specific relief for mining companies, which in general, we think is positive. And I think many mining companies would also agree that they haven't necessarily needed particular relief. It's important though to bear in mind, while prices perhaps have not been for the most part negatively affected, although in a sustained way, costs might have risen for some companies. So certainly companies that have had to shut down during this period but retain workers and continue to pay workers, which we think is obviously important. The safety and the health of workers is critical during this period. That comes at a cost. So it's important not to focus exclusively on prices, but to also appreciate that the cost profile of some mines may have changed. So I think to summarize, for me, it's, know your industry, know your commodity, understand the specific impacts of COVID. If you're going to provide tax relief, it should be targeted. Again, what phase of production is this project in? Does tax relief make sense? What's the size of the workforce, the contribution to your economy? And if you are going to offer tax relief, what conditions do you require or do you set? So for example, do you take an equity stake in return for the tax relief that you provide? Do you treat it as a loan? Making the condition that you have to retain workers, abandon tax planning arrangements. These sorts of conditions, I think, are appropriate. So there is some kind of quid pro quo between government and investors. So I think the message is it's not been a uniform impact, and many mining companies have provided a lot of support to communities affected by COVID, which is really fantastic. But obviously we're not out of the woods yet, and so we may see some more requests for specific relief going forward. So having that kind of targeted framework is really critical to make sure that governments don't give up revenue unnecessarily.
Thank you very much, Ali. We've run for just over 2.5 hours, and I think that's long enough for any Zoom. But finally, I just want to thank the team here that's been off stage. This Zoom has been immensely complicated. I've been the front guy, but the guys who did the real work are behind me. And so I'd just like to end this by thanking everybody. We are a team here at the Blavatnik School. It shows up again and again in this course. I do hope you'll come here and benefit from it. Thank you very much.